Here it is, the promised libertarian video.
Looks like PoliDice is trying to debunk libertarianism again. Yep, my time to shine.
Sorry for the delay, but I wanted to respond to that PragerU video, and as you all know, I despise PragerU for many, many reasons.
For me, PragerU has always been a bit of a mixed bag. While yes, it is true that their videos can be pretty cringy at times, a lot of their videos could actually be pretty excellent. For example, I think PragerU does an excellent job explaining the issues with public health care.
Mostly the rampant misinformation,
Oh, come on now, PoliDice. Like none of your videos contain any misinformation.
but another thing that really gets under my skin is that they try to frame their political activism as an educational resource.
Well, I mean, it could be argued that PragerU is educational. Now, granted, it is true that they get things wrong sometimes, but their content is still created with the intention to inform or educate people.
Indeed, all of their videos are categorized as education, even their most brazenly partisan videos that don't even try to be educational.
You do realize that something can be educational or informative and still have a partisan bias. For example, PoliDice, a lot of your content clearly does have a partisan bias, but it would be wrong to say that you're not attempting to inform or educate people about these issues, are you not?
But they're not alone. There's also the Foundation for Economic Education. But while PragerU is a conservative mouthpiece funded by the Wilkes brothers, V is a libertarian mouthpiece.
This simply isn't an apples-to-apples comparison. While it is true that PragerU openly identifies as conservative, the Foundation for Economic Education has no similar partisan identification. Rather, they identify with a set of values which them in and of themselves are not partisan.
He's funded by the Koch brothers.
The Foundation for Economic Freedom is not funded by the Koch brothers, at least not according to any source that I can find. Koch Industries does not list the Foundation of Economic Freedom as a media partner on their website, and if you look at FEE's tax returns, nowhere does it list Koch Industries as a donor. So as far as I know, PoliDice is just pulling this out of his ass.
More specifically, they promote the Austrian School of Economics, which makes it all the more hilarious they call themselves the Foundation for Economic Education.
Well, hold on a second. How is that hilarious? I mean, Austrian economics is a legitimate school of economics, is it not?
Since Austrian economics is not within the scope of modern mainstream economics.
Well, hold on a second. What does that mean exactly? Not within the scope of modern mainstream economics. What is mainstream economics anyways? And furthermore, why would not being within the scope of mainstream economics automatically make Austrian economics invalid?
Mainstream economics includes Keynesians to the left, and to the right there are the monetarists and supply-siders.
Oh, okay, I think I get it. Mainstream economics is only stuff taught in government schools, because those are the economic theories that helps the government push their policy agendas.
But monetarists and supply-siders still accept the basic precepts of modern economics.
And what exactly are those basic precepts? Are you going to explain or not?
Austrians do not.
You do know that monetarists and Austrians actually agree on a lot of stuff, right? So it seems kind of arbitrary to say then that monetarists are a legitimate school of economics, but Austrians aren't.
And what I find completely baffling about their supporters is that, in my experience, they are so sure of themselves that they will denounce mainstream economics as fake economics.
It's not so much that we believe that mainstream economics is fake economics. It's rather to point out that there's a massive bias involved in the way that economics tends to be taught in mainstream academia. Because a lot of these institutions are funded by the government, it means that there's more of an incentive to push an agenda that's favorable to the government when teaching economics. For example, public schools might be incentivized to make it out as if government regulations are more essential to the economy than they actually are.
There are people who will say that somebody like Paul Krugman, who has a PhD in economics, teaches economics, has written economics textbooks, and has won a Nobel Prize in economics.
This may be somewhat of a minor nitpick, but there isn't actually such a thing as a Nobel Prize in economics. It's actually called the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences.
Does not understand economics.
Paul Krugman might have a lot of credentials, but that doesn't mean he knows what the hell he's talking about. Anyone who's familiar with Paul Krugman will know this man is quite the treasure trove of some pretty gnarly hot takes. This is the guy who said Nazi Germany starting the Holocaust was the reason the Great Depression ended. He's also the guy who predicted that the internet was just going to be this temporary fad and it wouldn't make a permanent impact on the world. Probably his biggest doozy was trying to argue that the government should artificially create a bubble in the housing market to combat the dot-com bubble. Is this really the kind of guy you want to use as a reference, PoliDice?
We are talking about people, most of whom probably couldn't even tell you how GDP is calculated.
Well, we know how GDP is calculated. It's just not that useful of a metric, because it doesn't tell you anything about the quality of life of the average person living in any particular country. For example, a country where people made nothing but mud pies all day would technically have a very high GDP. Doesn't mean that the people living there are happy or prosperous.
Insisting that they know more than actual experts because they know a few Austrian talking points.
Really, bruh, you're using a tweet from Kyle Kalinske as a source? What am I talking about? Of course he is.
So, what is Austrian economics? It's basically a holdover from the 19th century. It rejects key aspects of modern economics like statistical analysis, mathematical models, and basically all of macroeconomics, instead choosing to frame everything in terms of the individual and individual decisions.
Are those somehow mutually exclusive? I don't see why you couldn't have a theory of economics that focuses on individual decisions while still using mathematical models and statistical analysis.
So, you can see why this isn't taught much in economics classrooms.
It has to do with that point that I brought up earlier. An education system run by a government, which wants its regulatory tentacles into everything, is not likely to teach you an economic theory that emphasizes the individual's freedom of choice.
And is instead reserved for far-right think tanks.
Of course, everyone who disagrees with PoliDice is all on the far right. Could have seen that one coming, huh? You do realize that most people who follow Austrian economics would likely disagree with a lot of what the far right wants, such as the war on drugs and immigration restrictions. I mean, heck, Hitler and Mussolini straight up nationalized entire sectors of their economy. What's Austrian about that?
Austrians argue that individuals are, by definition, best at maximizing their own utility.
Well, that makes sense to me. I mean, after all, who knows what your needs and wants are better than you? I mean, what's the alternative? Have some kind of central planning committee? Somehow figure out the best way to meet the needs and wants of every single individual?
And so every exchange must be mutually beneficial.
Well, yeah, in a free economy where there's no coercion, an exchange would not happen unless it was beneficial to both sides. The whole reason any trade even happens in the first place is because both sides value what the other side has over what they have. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for them to engage in the trade. It wouldn't make any sense for someone to trade for something that they value less than what they already have.
And anything that gets in the way of these free exchanges, like a tax or regulation, by definition, reduces prosperity.
Well, that's because taxes and regulations force people to use resources in ways less optimal than it would be if they were free to use them otherwise. You're basically robbing individuals of their freedom to maximize their own utility.
So it's basically alternative economics for libertarians and anarcho-capitalists.
It's not just libertarians and anarcho-capitalists who like to put emphasis on the decisions made by individuals and individuals maximizing their own utility. This is actually what the entire field of microeconomics is based around.
And one of the conclusions that you come to from this free market is always right mentality is,
we're not necessarily arguing that the free market is always right, or that individuals or firms within the free market will always make the best decisions. Just that government central planning isn't the best way to correct for these market errors.
why nothing is overpriced.
I'm going to criticize the title of that video for a second because it is somewhat misleading. It's not necessarily that nothing is overpriced, but rather what makes something overpriced is a subjective judgment call. And this is important to point out for reasons we'll get to later in the video.
That's right, the good folks over at FEE are here to defend price gouging.
So in case you're not aware of what price gouging is, it's basically the idea that someone can charge a price for something above what is considered fair and that somehow victimizes people. The problem with price gouging is that it's basically a non-concept. It doesn't exist. Because in order for the concept of price gouging to exist, you have to basically take for granted that all goods and services have some kind of objective value for which it's unfair to charge above, and that doing so necessarily negatively impacts people, both of which can be called into doubt.
Hey, it's Freedom Tunes.
I know this is somewhat of a minor nitpick, but it's actually the foundation for economic freedom. The video just so happens to be hosted by the same person who does Freedom Tunes.
Yeah, I call this one VCR with a butter knife stuck in it. Brilliant.
Visionary. I must have it. Name your price.
I don't know, I guess like $13 trillion or something.
Yes, I'll give you 4 trillion.
How dare you insult me? No deal.
I'll pay the asking price.
13 trillion? That trash isn't worth 13 trillion.
You're right. 14 trillion.
What? No! Don't do that, it's worthless.
Mind your business, lady. Actually,
Huh?
if you think about it, things are really just worth whatever price the buyer and seller agree on. If either of them thinks the price is wrong, they can walk away.
You're looking at a massive price-fixing scheme.
By the way, I didn't edit anything out there. That whole Adam ruins everything clip he decides to include just abruptly ends like that. Like, what's the point of including that short of a clip where we don't even get to see the context of what's being argued? I guess maybe he had to cut it short for copyright reasons, but even then, you could explain what point's being made in the clip.
Yeah, anyone care to argue that that's all free and fair market pricing and in no way overpriced?
So PoliDice tries using the winner's curse as an argument for why something can become overpriced. So first of all, the winner's curse only applies to auctions. This isn't going to apply to a majority of economic transactions. And second of all, and more importantly, the mere existence of auctions disproves the point that PoliDice is trying to make. You couldn't really have an auction unless value was subjective, because if value was objective, then everyone would all bid at the same price because there's one objectively true value of that item.
This is the problem with imagining that everything is a perfectly competitive free enterprise system.
We don't imagine that everything's a perfectly competitive free enterprise system. Quite the opposite, actually. We recognize that the government does a lot to control and regulate things, so we don't truly have a fully open competitive free market. Which is why when market failures get blamed on the free market, it's pretty absurd.
Eventually the theory has to meet the real world.
It almost always does. In almost every situation, the economic principles that libertarians support play out in the real world. The exceptions are when government tries to stick its nose in and control something.
That's ridiculous.
Not really. Economic value is entirely subjective.
That's true, but it doesn't mean that the price is always right.
Well, if economic value is subjective, then who exactly is it that decides if the price is right?
Where producer surplus equals consumer surplus. Surplus meaning the amount that you're willing to pay minus the cost. The consumer being the buyer and the producer being the seller. Under the right circumstances of competitiveness, openness, and price elasticity, the market will naturally reach that equilibrium because if consumer surplus is higher than producer surplus, then the price will go up. And if producer surplus is higher than consumer surplus, i.e. if it's overpriced, then they'll just buy something else.
And how are those surpluses determined exactly? This is just a more roundabout way of admitting that value is subjective.
That's not usually the real world.
Yeah, it is. The laws of supply and demand determine the price and quantity of pretty much everything in the economy.
Especially when it comes to, I don't know, a life-saving drug.
Well, yeah, why wouldn't these same laws of economics apply to a life-saving drug? I mean, you said it yourself, PoliDice. If a producer charges too much, the customers will just go elsewhere. And in a free economy with no patents or regulations, there'd be a lot of other places they could go to get that same drug.
Instead of charging at a fair market price, you can charge people at their willingness to pay.
Yeah, no shit. You can charge anybody for anything at their willingness to pay. The willingness to pay is what the demand curve is. That's part of how a fair market price is determined.
Because if they don't buy it, then they'll die.
That doesn't mean the value isn't still subjective. It just means that there are higher stakes and therefore more to take into consideration. Think of it this way. If you were about to die, would you spend an exorbitant amount of money on a drug that could save your life? If you're a young person watching this, your answer is most likely yes. Because to a young person with their whole life ahead of them, the concept of death is pretty scary. But let's say perhaps that maybe you're an older person, say in your late 80s or 90s. You've already lived a full life, you've already experienced most of what life has to offer. For you, this drug might only add a year or two to your life at best. Perhaps you'd be better off just using your money to enjoy what little time you have left. So even when death is a consideration in an economic exchange, the value is still at the end of the day subjective.
In this case, all or most of that total surplus goes to the producer.
Well, the consumer got a drug that saved their life. I would consider that a pretty big surplus.
This is not an economically efficient exchange. It is overpriced.
Not efficient according to who? I mean, in this scenario, the consumer got a drug that saved their life. I'd be pretty happy in their situation.
But supporters of the Austrian school don't believe in these graphs. They believe in methodical individualism, so...
These graphs are methodical individualism, PoliDice. All these graphs are really doing is showing aggregately what happens when a bunch of people make decisions that maximize their own utility. That's it.
That's not price gouging.
Again, price gouging doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an objectively fair price for a commodity above which it's immoral to charge for.
That's a beautiful, mutually beneficial exchange. The producer valued the money more than the drug, and the consumer valued their life more than the money.
He's saying this in like a sarcastic mocking tone, but I mean it's absolutely true. An economic exchange happens because both parties have something the other values more. That's as true in the case of medicine as it is anything else.
In fact, everyone who bought that drug Their lives were saved by Martin Shkreli, so
We're not arguing that their lives were saved by Martin Shkreli. Their lives were saved by the people who initially invested in and developed that drug. All Martin Shkreli did was abuse the patent system so he could jack up the price and make a ridiculous profit. You do realize that most libertarians are against this, right?
who are you to get in the way of this beautiful voluntary exchange?
Well, I don't know what has been the result of government artificially getting in the way of voluntary exchanges where it comes to healthcare. Longer wait times, rationing of care, people dying on waiting lists. Granted, the US healthcare system is far from perfect, but as a comparatively more marketized system, we avoid a lot of those pitfalls.
Basically Stalin.
How good you think healthcare was in the Soviet Union, buddy? You think those people slaving away in gulags all day got access to life-saving drugs whenever they needed them? Probably not.
Now, of course, not all of them will make this argument. Usually they'll just shift the blame.
Wait, how are we the ones shifting the blame? You leftists are the ones blaming the free market on all these different problems, when we don't even have a free market and we have a bunch of government control of everything.
And say that this would never happen in a real free market.
That's not shifting the blame. That's a simple matter of fact. In an actual competitive free market, there wouldn't be patents, basically giving one entity or organization the right to monopolize a drug and therefore charge whatever they want for it. Patents are a construct of the state, not the free market.
But that's not the argument that Fee and others are making.
Yeah, it is. Seamus has tons of other videos in which he explains how regulations and government interventions in the economy cause a lot of these problems that the free market gets blamed for.
They're arguing that, by definition, nothing is overpriced.
Again, the argument isn't necessarily that nothing is overpriced. It's that what makes something overpriced is a subjective judgment call. Seamus makes this clear multiple times in the video.
And they will argue that, even in situations where someone's life is on the line.
As I've mentioned previously, the laws of economics are still in play, even when someone's life is on the line. Perhaps even more so because, with higher stakes comes higher emphasis on resource management.
Don't believe me?
That may be the case for something as abstract as art, but for actual goods and services, it's different.
Is it? Let me ask you, would you trade a diamond for a bottle of water?
No way.
Why not?
Because a bottle of water only costs $1 and diamonds are worth thousands of dollars.
Okay, but what if you were trapped on a desert island with no water and a treasure chest full of diamonds? Would you trade one diamond for some water then?
Oh, well, I guess.
The value of goods or services change. In the city, you have tons of water whenever you need it, but diamonds are rare and beautiful, so water is worth almost nothing to you, even though you need it to survive, and diamonds are worth a lot. But in the desert, you have no water, and you can't drink shiny rocks, so...
See, that is not a free, fair, voluntary exchange.
Yeah, it is. The buyer isn't being forced to buy the water, nor is the seller being forced to sell the water. They're engaging in this transaction because both sides stand to mutually benefit from it.
That's coercion.
You keep using the word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
So, PoliDice doesn't seem to know what coercion means. Coercion is when you use a threat of physical violence to compel someone to behave a particular way. Simply making someone an offer is not coercion, because the person you're making an offer to has the freedom to not accept the offer.
That is making a deal with someone whose life is on the line.
Okay, so what's the alternative? Not making the deal at all in the first place? So then the person is in a much worse off position than they were before?
Selling an EpiPen that only costs a few dollars to make for hundreds of dollars is coercion.
No, it's not. I mean, yeah, it's bullshit. I'll agree with PoliDice on that, but it's not coercion.
Price gouging basic necessities to hurricane survivors who need them is coercion.
So-called price gouging essential supplies to hurricane survivors actually saves lives. It's true. If there's more money to be made by supplying resources to hurricane survivors, then more resources will get supplied where they're needed. It's simple economics. I mean, what's the alternative? Sit on your ass and wait for FEMA to get involved?
Fine. But I still don't understand why someone would pay $13 trillion for a VCR with a butter knife in it.
It isn't worth that much to you, and that's totally okay. But when you're thinking about how much something is worth, you're thinking about how much you are going to value having that thing in comparison to how much you value whatever it is you're being asked to trade for it. Obviously, weirdo art has no value to you, but for someone who loves that kind of thing, well, everybody is unique. We all have different wants and needs and different resources as well. As a result, we all value things differently. And that means sometimes we aren't always going to understand why other people are willing to pay a ton of money for stuff that we think is worthless.
Again, the theory needs to meet the real world.
The theory does meet the real world. Supply and demand is the basis for determining not only the price of goods, but also the quantity produced. When you try to have the government interfere with that process, as PoliDice seems to advocate for, you get problems such as underproduction or wasted resources.
Sure, in a competitive, open, price-elastic market, the price is just a fair deal between buyers and sellers. But not when it comes to healthcare, education, wages, infrastructure, or really any industry that, for whatever reason, is fundamentally not fit for pure market conditions.
Are you going to explain why these aren't fit to operate under pure market conditions? Because to me, these are all commodities based on limited resources, just like everything else in the economy. And if your plan is to have the government centrally control all of it, then can you explain to me exactly why it is you think that would work better than just letting people figure it out for themselves?
And of course, any industry is vulnerable to fraud and market failure, which is why we need regulation to keep private interests in check.
Of course, more government tentacles is always the answer. And if the private sector is so vulnerable to fraud and corruption, well then why aren't these government bureaucrats you love so much? What, are they angels from up on high or something?
Why did you make this thing anyway?
Oh, I'm really just doing a performance piece. Incredible! What's it called?
Rich idiots overpaying for pretentious nonsense?
Okay, I know this was just meant to be a joke, but it does show that they understand what they're saying just doesn't hold up to common sense. If you see something that's obviously overpriced, instead of assuming that it was just a good bargain between buyer and seller or that they're just idiots, look into the underlying reasons why it's overpriced and how we can solve it instead of reflexively defending a deeply flawed system.
Right, so you'd be in favor of getting rid of all the regulations that make things more expensive than they need to be, right? Somehow I have a feeling that that's not the case.
And speaking of voting, please do it. The midterms are only a few weeks away. If you care about the kinds of unregulated, unchecked capitalism I discussed in this video,
Yeah, because capitalism and individual freedom of choice is so scary, am I right?
then you can't let the Republicans stay in power.
Yeah, because a completely free, unregulated marketplace is totally what Republicans want. It's not like they've been calling for, tariffs and the drug war, banning companies from hiring immigrants.
Or show them what happens when the people make their voices heard.
Yay, I get to choose between two ass clowns to take my money and boss me around. Gee, the people have so much power when they vote, don't they?
Some people won't be able to vote because of rampant voter suppression, and it's up to us to make sure that they don't get away with that.
Yeah, to people on the left, something as simple as requiring an ID to vote is this horrible form of voter suppression. But whatever, that's a topic for another video. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Everyone take care.